Scuba goes under the sea. The podcast for the inquisitive diver.
Hey there, dive buddies, and welcome to the show. My next guest is a co-founder and principal scientist at the Marine Megafauna Foundation, where he leads the Global Whale Shark Research Program and a science advisor to the Global Whale Shark Photo Identification Database. He has recently co-edited a textbook, Whale Sharks, Biology, Ecology and Conservation, which will be available this coming August, and has also been involved in the publication of over 50 scientific papers. Geekiness aside, Simon is not too shabby with a camera and co-hosts a wildlife and travel photography gig called Nature Tripper, a website and magazine with his better half and conservation designer Madeline Pearce, aka Mads. Oh, and to top it all off, he's a Kiwi, so he's not only a brain box, but he's probably got a sense of humour too. Simon, welcome to the show, buddy. How you doing?
Thanks very much, man. It's great to be here.
Did I get all that right?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Very flattering. Thank you.
No dramas. It's a bit of a tongue twister when I try to get through it all.
Yeah, so much science, so little time.
I know, right? Oh. Okay. Well, talking of science, how did it all begin for you? How did you get into the watery world?
Well, I learnt to dive when I was at university, and that was a bit of a game changer for me, really. I was already studying biology, and I was very interested in conservation. But when I first started diving and snorkeling up in Vanuatu on a family holiday, I saw all these kind of neon-coloured fish, and just you don't really see that amongst terrestrial life in New Zealand so much. So I was pretty blown away, and then thought, well, also after watching people go kind of crazy in the bush for weeks on end, the idea of warm water marine biology started sounding quite attractive to me, really.
Yeah.
So I moved over to Australia and started studying sharks and rays, and that's where I became really good friends with Andrea Marshall, and who was doing her PhD on manta rays. Mm-hmm. And we ended up co-founding this Marine Megafauna Foundation, where we work on manta rays, with Andrea in charge of that and me in charge of the whale shark research program.
Happy days. It's a small world. I've heard of Andrea Marshall through Anna Flam when she used to come across to Thailand when I was working there. So she's on the manta bit, you're on the whale shark bit. How long's it been going? When was it set up?
Seems like such a long time ago, but also just yesterday. I first started working on whale sharks with Andrea over in Mozambique in 2005. So I was doing my PhD in Brisbane at the time on some of the sharks and rays found up here. And then, she she was like, it'd be quite good to have a dive buddy. And also there's lots of interesting stuff to check out over here. So I thought that sounded like, pretty interesting opportunity. I'd never been to Africa before. I kind of thought I was going to get jumped by lions as I got off the plane or something. But nevertheless, checked it out. And it really is a pretty amazing place. And the whale sharks just blew me away.
Yeah. And have you always had a love for the whale sharks, or is that just something that's progressed through time in the water?
It's definitely developed, actually. So it was coming from New Zealand, where we've got lots of endangered species and things, but also a lot of really good work going on in terms of conservation. I was kind of drawn to some of the stuff that people weren't really paying much attention to, things like lizards and stuff. And then a lot of my PhD ended up being on stingrays because I realized there was nothing known about them and they were really under threat. Mm. So then whale sharks, this big, iconic, charismatic species. And I was like, well, I don't really care. Surely we know everything about these animals. Mm. That's not somewhere where that I'm interested in. I can't help. But then when I started looking into it, just pretty much to humor Andrea, I realized that actually there wasn't much known about them, and there was still some good sized fisheries going on at that point. And I was like, these things are a bit screwed, actually. Mm. So that's when I started really getting interested. So it was very much because I was interested in conservation as my kind of primary thing. I kind of think of myself as a bit of a problem solver. Mm-hmm. And when I realized that whale sharks were kind of a problem to be solved, that's what really got me interested. But when you start working with them, they're an amazing animal. So So yeah, I mean, I love them now. But it was definitely the problem that intrigued me initially.
It was the whale shark that actually got me into the water. I was actually petrified of the water as a kid, but my dad called me down I think I must have been about 7 or 8 years old, and called me down to see what was on the TV, and it was a whale shark, and I was just completely mesmerised. But like you say, there's so little that we still don't know about them.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's so awesome I think it's something you don't really get on land, where you can be so close to such a large animal, but in complete safety. Like they really are such an amazing ambassador for marine life in general.
Mm. Yeah. Well, the big softies, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely.
I had actually just thinking, saying about softies, we had an incident a few years ago in Thailand where one was literally being a puppy underwater, and it was chasing divers, and we thought it was, trying to nudge divers out the way to exit and go in a direction, but it would stop and turn around and come back, and it was just nudging divers for about 20-25 minutes, and it was literally like an underwater puppy, but 4 meters long.
yeah. Big puppy, but yeah, they're super cute, eh? Like you get that I think especially sometimes when you run into sharks that haven't seen people before, and they're just obsessed. It's so awesome. It's really good for photography.
Oh yeah. So the research that you're doing with the animals, I've done a bit of Facebook stalking and looking through your Twitter and all that kind of thing. Can you talk us through some of the stuff that you do? Like I noticed that there's tagging going on and ultrasound and all sorts of scientific-y kind of stuff. What's it all about?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's still all about the conservation for me. So we did a global conservation assessment of the species back in 2016, and we found that actually more than half of the world's population had been killed off since the 1980s or so. So that really brought home how much work there still is to do. And with the research we're doing, like sort of you alluded to before, there's still some pretty big questions around their biology and things, but also just how many of them are left. But one of the really cool things about whale sharks is, like I said before, you can get close to them in complete safety. There are some good places like Thailand where you can be in the water with them fairly regularly. And it makes them a really good species to kind of trial some of these non-invasive techniques. So we can learn more about them without actually disturbing them. And it's a pretty cool evolution, because when I started working on whale sharks back in 2005, I remember my PhD supervisor at the time, he was just like, well, you're going to have to kill a couple, right? And I was like, what? And he's going, well, yeah, I mean, you can't really research them unless you're able to dissect them and things like that. And I was like, well, the dolphin and whale people seem to have some stuff going on. He's like, yeah, I don't know about what they're up to. So I was like, well, I'm going to find out. And found that with the dolphins and whales and things, they were often using things like photographic identification, where you can tell individuals apart by sort of characteristic markings and things like that, like the flukes on, like the tails on humpback whales, or the fin sort of mark kind of cuts and things on dolphins and stuff. And I was like, well, whale sharks are a really good candidate for that kind of work, because we can distinguish them using their characteristic kind of white spots as sort of a fingerprint for each one.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just kind of like we started trying to work with them underwater and then try and do things like work out how big they were. So we started using things like lasers on a camera, so we could project lasers points onto them and see how big they were and things. And we just keep on trying to find out more and more about them without disturbing them, really. And it's been really cool to, recently, as you said, there's it was actually some colleagues that work in an aquarium up in Okinawa, and they've pioneered a waterproofed ultrasound unit, and they've been able to trial it on a few species up there, like manta rays, and also they've got a whale shark up there. And then, so they joined us in the field out in the Galapagos to try and use it out there for the first time. So that was definitely an exciting project to be part of.
Yeah.
And we've now worked out how to take blood samples from them when they're swimming around kind of unrestrained and things as well. So it is pretty cool to try and push the boundaries of what we can achieve. And hopefully that's, well, we're already seeing with some of the techniques that it's kind of filtering down to some of the other species that even less is known about.
Mm. So was it, just going back a step, is it you guys that narrowed down the spot markings to identify the whale sharks? Because I've always been told that we should try and photograph the left-hand side just above the pectoral fins.
Yeah, so there was actually a medical doctor that was working over in Western Australia up in Exmouth. Mm-hmm. And he was the first person to really pioneer kind of field research on whale sharks back in the 1980s. And he was certainly the first one that kind of raised the possibility of identifying them by their spots and sort of started that project over there.
Okay.
And then there was one of the guy, Brad Norman, who's also from WA. He did his master's out there in the 90s. And from that started trying to create more of a database. So I was one of the first people to get involved in that kind of global database. But like there's some very clever computer scientists and things that are heavily involved in that. So I'm kind of coming at it from the user side, as opposed to the artificial intelligence side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is it similar to the database or the software that's used for recognizing the mantas?
Same sort of concept. Yeah. There's actually, manta rays were a bit trickier because they don't have such sort of regular spots as a whale shark, and they've got like more blotches and things like that. And just a lot of things were more difficult with manta rays. Mm. So they were able to push the algorithms and stuff and develop that more, because there's so much interest in that sort of field for all sorts of things these days, like the like kind of using photography and all sorts of things, facial recognition, all sorts. So the computer science has really come along, and actually just now we're starting to use the algorithms they developed for mantas for whale sharks, and that's probably better than what we were using previously.
Happy days. And how big is this database getting then? Is it?
It's pretty incredible, actually. Since I've been involved, we went from less than 1,000 sharks, almost all of which were from Western Australia, to now I think we're at around 13,000 sharks from, I think, 50 plus countries. Yeah. So it really is a global database now.
Happy days. What do we know from start to finish? Where are they born? What size are they when they're born? What depths are they born at? How far do they migrate? How long do they live? Where do they breed? All of the above. Do you want to try and give an overall kind of lifestyle or lifespan of Destiny?
I mean, no, because that'd kill my job security. I've got a whole career to figure that stuff out. No, it was interesting actually, because when we went through you mentioned the textbook. So we've just been editing this textbook on what we do know on whale sharks, and it's amazing that we've got enough to fill quite a thumping book, but there are still some pretty big knowledge gaps there. And one of the kind of fun things I was involved in was trying to come up with a hypotheses on what their life cycle might be. And there's like so much of it is just waving my hands in the air based on pretty much based on where we don't see them. So like, for instance, like say over in Western Australia at Ningaloo Reef, most of the sharks there are juvenile males. And that's turned out to be a real cliche throughout the world, like Mozambique, where I was working initially, and in places like Tanzania and Mexico and the Arabian region and the Philippines and all these other places. It's all these juvenile and Thailand as well. It's all these juvenile males. And we're just like, okay, well, we can find these juvenile males, but where are the rest of them? And yeah, so hardly anyone is seeing any whale sharks between like birth size, which is probably about kind of 50, 60 centimeters long.
Okay.
And then they disappear and or we just don't see them. We don't see them when they're that size either. But then they start re-emerging at these kind of coastal feeding areas at about 3 or 4 meters long. Seems to be the pattern. So that's a very small whale shark to be, like, even though it's nowhere near their birth size, like they're just off somewhere else at that point. And there's so many people in the water these days, like between fishing and diving and people cruising around on boats, that you would, if they were obvious, we would see them. So I figured they're living somewhere that is not obvious, which most likely is kind of out in the open ocean or something, and possibly not at the surface the whole time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's like, it's very much we know where they're not because we don't really see them. So it's kind of trying to figure out, okay, where are the places where we're not very good at looking. Because obviously, the open ocean stuff, I mean, that's the biggest habitat in the world, but it's very difficult to study. And because whale sharks, I mean, they won't take a bait or anything like that. So they don't tend to get caught on things like long lines and that, like a lot of other commercially caught species. Species are like sort of blues and makos and things that, again, are like quite open ocean species, but we know a lot more about them. Yeah. So, yeah, there's plenty to unpack with that question. There's unsurprisingly, but yeah, in recent years we've been. I've kind of been trying to focus in on a bit more about what the females are doing, because with a very depleted population, as I said earlier, those are the ones, like, we need them to breed. We need more whale sharks. So it's the juvenile males. It's great to learn more about them, but that is not helping the species recover. We need to make sure we're like effectively protecting these, especially the females that are kind of close to the size of adulthood, because those are the ones that have been through that time, probably quite long period where they're small and they're probably quite vulnerable to natural predators and things. And these are the ones that have got a long breeding life ahead of them. But we're just not very good at finding them so far. So we've identified a few places where we can see fairly large females on a fairly regular basis, and they're all a long way offshore, like way over the continental shelf. Places like the Northern Galapagos Islands and St. Helena out in the mid-Atlantic, and some offshore seamounts off Mexico. So we kind of figure that the adults are moving out into this open ocean because that's the only place we are seeing them. But still some pretty big gaps there.
Well, do we know, Christina Zanato, she asked me a question to ask you, seeing as she has a lot to do with sharks in the Bahamas. But she tends to see, obviously, those Caribbean sharks, using their mangroves as a nursery. Do we have any kind of idea on where whale sharks would do this kind of nursery? Is it another one that's an unknown?
It's a super interesting question. And short answer is I don't know. And the long answer is, like, it's a really interesting don't know, I think. So they've kind of found with some of the open ocean species like blues and makos that they do use what we kind of define as nursery areas, but they're pelagic nursery areas. So really quite large areas of the open ocean where you're likely to find the little ones. And a big part of that might be because, like, they're kind of crappy bits of the ocean without much productivity. So there isn't much there aren't too many larger predators that would try to eat them, because obviously that's a pretty big priority for a small shark, is not getting eaten. So I've got my suspicions that the whale sharks might be doing something similar, but almost completely without evidence. So I guess to give you some context on that, there's probably only been like maybe 40 baby whale sharks of less than a meter long or so that have ever been found in the wild. So, wow. And they've been very scattered across the world. So we really don't know very much about them. But yeah, that's my suspicion at the moment. Yeah. Like, ask me again tomorrow, I might give a different answer. But I would not be surprised if they are using these, what I'd call kind of a pelagic nursery area somewhere. Don't know where yet.
Yeah. Well, I suppose there's even there's possibilities that it could be constantly moving as well, I suppose. I'm just thinking about other...
And I mean, oceanographic conditions that are going to really... I mean, it's a very dynamic environment out there. So, yeah, for sure, it might not be a very reliable place to go looking. Yeah. And I mean, baby whale sharks, like when you look at them, I mean, they've got a very like floppy kind of swimming motion and things. I mean, they look completely useless. So they're probably not very good swimmers when they're... So I suspect they might be... I mean, they're probably not very good at swimming long distances. They're basically plankton themselves. Yeah. So yeah, certainly if there's like shifting kind of ocean currents and things going around, they're likely to get shifted with it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask as well was your opinion on, still going on the young whale sharks, but those locations around the world where locals feed the whale sharks, and you know it helps tourism, etc., etc. But we see so many whale sharks, adult whale sharks, that have severe scarring across their backs from where they've been hit by boats, and I can't help think that these incidences might have increased because the sharks are recognizing hulls as a source of food. Have you guys ever looked at that kind of thing?
I certainly think it's kind of the big controversy in whale sharks. I think is this the kind of provisioning tourism, as they refer to it, when people kind of feed them to habituate them to people and make sure they can get kind of up close and regular encounters and things. Yeah. I think it's a nuanced one. Like, I mean, there's no denying like how much money it brings into some of these, at least previously impoverished communities in some really remote areas, and people can certainly value the whale sharks more when they are like tangibly worth something to them. I think it depends a little bit on the area and stuff and how much it's done too. But like in general, I'm not a big fan of the practice. I think for me, coming from the kind of conservation side of things, like they're an endangered species, and if we're going to be basically exploiting them for profit, there needs to be something in it for the species as well. Yeah. So if some of these like places like Oslo, for instance, which is of course the largest of them, and you've got hundreds of thousands of people going to Cebu in the Philippines to see these sharks. It's one of the largest tourism attractions in the Philippines now. Now, I mean, that money isn't really going back into, certainly not whale shark conservation. So I think the missed opportunity with some of these mass tourism sites with whale sharks is that their like education and stuff that they give to their guests is not very good either. So you've got an opportunity with a place like that to create hundreds of thousands of ambassadors for whale sharks each year, and that has value for sure. That would be a useful thing, but like as far as I know, the education hasn't really improved either since the last time I was there. So at the moment, like, I mean, I think there are bigger problems for whale sharks than bad tourism, but it's certainly a very visible one, and it's one of the ways where people are clearly profiting from the sharks. And I really think that more could be done to ensure that's more of a partnership between kind of humans and the sharks to help them bounce back. Yeah,
for sure. Well, let's move on to the stuff that you guys do know. How do you track these guys? Because they, you know, I'm expecting that they travel freely all over the place, or do they have migratory routes that you see them on regularly? Or
yeah, well, we're still sort of trying to work that out, but yeah, it's a really interesting problem because they do. I mean, they move a long way. I mean, they can easily do 100 kilometers in a day, and we're talking sort of 10, 20,000 kilometers a year. Even if they're not going very far, I mean, they're like in distance wise, they're constantly swimming. So they're covering a huge amount of ground. So basically, like, we can't follow them in boats. They're just moving too far and too fast. So we've had to use tags that can communicate with satellites so that we can retrieve the data from them remotely. But there we've run into the technological limitation in that we don't have tags at the stage that can communicate through water and air. So we either have to have like a receiving station underwater and collect information from the tags underwater, or we've got to get them up into the air somehow. So one way we've been doing that is using putting tags on the top of their dorsal fins just now, like on little kind of clamps that are sort of designed to last for a few months. And then each time the shark comes up near the surface, if there's a satellite, the correct type of satellite overhead, then we'll get like a ping of where our shark is that day. So that's a really good way to see where they're going. The problem is that sometimes like they won't come to the surface for a month or so, like at least long enough for the tag to be able to communicate with the satellite.
Yeah.
So the other kind of tag we've been using is these what we call archival tags, and they're designed to just stay on the shark, record data, and usually we set them for about 6 months or so, and then they've got a little electronic release, and they fall off the shark. They float up to the surface, and then when they're floating on the surface, they can then upload their data to the satellite. So from them, we get really good information on like depth and things that the sharks are swimming at, but quite rough information on where they're swimming, because rather than getting like a GPS track where it's trying to reconstruct their movement based on time of sunrise and sunset and when the sun is like midday time. So especially in the tropics, that's quite tough because you don't get that variation in day length. But yeah, it's kind of been a combination of the two types really. So we've definitely seen some places like the Galapagos where we've been doing a lot of tagging on adult female whale sharks, the really, really big ones. They do seem to have a pretty regular pattern of movement. Like we suspect they're heading out into what for them is kind of a feeding area out in the Eastern Pacific, where there's a lot of currents meeting and it's a very productive area. And then often they're cruising back towards the South American mainland, but not usually staying in like a few hundred meters of water. Like they're still a reasonable way offshore. But again, very productive area. So they seem to have a bit of a circuit they do. But the problem for us is getting tags to stay on for more than a few months. Okay. So it's pretty hard to see like whether they're doing kind of an annual loop or on a larger time scale or something like that. Yeah. We only really get a snapshot.
And you're going back? Are you going back to the Galapagos next year?
Next year, yes. Yeah. So obviously things have been pretty interrupted over the last 18 months or so.
Just a bit.
But since the start of last year. But yeah, hopefully things are normalizing next year. But it's really good in that like the team we work with over in the Galapagos are mostly Ecuador based, and they will be getting out again next monch. So that's really cool. I'm sad that I won't be with them, but it's great that the work can continue.
Yeah. I'm much the same. I pushed mine back as well, but I've even taken the plunge and I've completely scrapped off the idea of next year and pushed it to 2023.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's certainly pretty difficult to plan ahead at the moment.
Just a bit. So what are you doing at the moment then? You must be climbing the walls.
I've been over in New Zealand for up until last month, and it was actually I had that textbook I mentioned before that was well overdue. The publisher had been very patient, but last year I really had no excuse rather than to get onto that. So it was actually it ended up being kind of good timing in that like I couldn't travel, so I had no excuse not to work on it. But also lots of people around the world that I work with were kind of in the same metaphorical boat. So there was lots of people going through their old data and publishing it and things, and like we learned a lot about whale sharks last year. I was very happy to send away the draft kind of early this year, and then my wife and I are over here in Brisbane now, and helping out some friends with some projects here in Australia. So it's good to get. It's been a long time between sharks for me, so it's been pretty good to get some diving in places like Byron Bay and stuff, and start some projects down there.
Oh, good on you. Oh, yeah, because we first started talking when you were you're looking at the wobbegongs, aren't you?
Yeah. So I was just trying to kind of get my head around what was being done at the moment, and my friend David that owns the Sundive Dive Centre at Byron Bay, he did his PhD with me several years ago now. So now that he's in Australia, he was pretty keen to get some research going, and he loves the leopard sharks.
Yeah.
And everyone does leopard sharks. They're just inherently a lovable species. So he was kind of like, well, why don't you come hang out and we can sort of brainstorm about other fun things to do. And like this, in Australia, like on the East Coast for sure. Wobbegongs are one of these things. There's plenty of them. You see them diving all the time, but actually not that much is known about them. One of my friends did his PhD on them like the same time I was kind of doing my PhD. And since then, there hasn't been a great deal done since, certainly in sort of like central New South Wales up. So yeah, I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. And yeah, kind of having a look around for things to do. Well, I can't play with my whale sharks this year. But yeah, certainly some of the stuff over here is super interesting as well. So I'm quite into it at the moment.
Oh, no pressure then. You and David have got to get your heads together and come up with some serious data for when I get David on the show. We've already had a few emails back and forth, so he's
oh, nice one.
They're going to be
he's got plenty to add.
Yeah. They'll be our gurus on Julian rocks.
Yep.
What do you know about the aggregation hotspots? Because every now and then you get those aerial photos come up with loads of whale sharks in one area. Is it generally food that attracts them to the locations?
Yes, always.
Always.
Yeah. I think of them as being like kind of the Labradors of the ocean. They're very highly food motivated.
Yeah.
So most of the time when you see these shots of lots of whale sharks together on the surface, it tends to be tuna spawn. Mm-hmm. So there's the tuna all get together and spawn in a specific area, and then all these little eggs, which are like very calorie dense, they're little kind of drops of oil in massive quantities. They all float up to the surface, and that is like an absolute extravaganza for whale sharks. So it happens quite consistently off sort of Cancun and the Atlantic coast of Mexico, or kind of Caribbean Gulf of Mexico, and off Qatar in the Arabian Gulf as well.
Oh, really?
And very similar situation in both. And especially Mexico, my suspicion is that whale sharks are traveling from maybe thousands of kilometers around to take advantage of that. There was some back of the envelope calculations done on their calorie intake. And it was something like 43,000 kilocalories, which meant nothing to me. So I put it in terms of chocolate, and that's about 8 kilograms of dairy milk chocolate per day. So there's, and a lot of the sharks are probably sticking around for a month or so. So, they might not, with that kind of calorie load for like a cold-blooded animal, they might not even need to feed much again, like for the rest of the year. Wow. So it's well worth sort of homing in on for them. So that's when you tend to get the big numbers together, where there's a really where there's a lot of food for them, a lot of calories.
8 kilos. Jesus.
Yeah,
I can eat a fair bit of chocolate.
Spirit animal, really.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same. On the serious bits then, endangerment. We all know that sharks, well, literally every shark in the bloody water is endangered, but how severe is the whale sharks count at the moment, and what's being done about it?
Whale sharks are probably more severe than most. They have, again, like when we were sort of putting together information to get this book out, we realized that they've got one of the, what we call like the slowest life histories of any shark. So they probably don't become adults till they're like 30 or 40 years old. And we don't know how old they get, but there's a good chance it's kind of 100 plus. So they really don't well, yeah, it takes them a long time to grow up. They're very slow growing and things. So, and when I mentioned before, like when they're small, they've probably got a lot of predators. But if the few that survive that kind of period of their lives, I kind of liken their life history a little bit to like sea turtles that have loads of babies. Only a few of them will survive. But if they do, then they've probably got quite a long life ahead of them. And whale sharks are similar, except people have started hunting them like when they've got to a few meters long. So we're getting this tiny fraction of whale sharks that have managed to survive, and then like just nailing them through fisheries. And you mentioned like boat strikes before, and that's probably one of the most significant threats now. So the problem has been that like it's actually very difficult to monitor their numbers for us. We're mostly been like, for instance, in Mozambique, like I was working in one kind of area where we consistently saw whale sharks. But I mean, whale sharks are super mobile. Like it's not like if the environment changes, they can just move. Like they don't seem to do it. But I mean, these sharks are easily capable of just swimming over to Western Australia if it's like better over there for them. So it's really difficult to disentangle like a true population decline or a recovery for that matter, from just them shifting around. So that's kind of what we've been trying to tease out. So at the moment though, based on what we like all the kind of various bits of information we were able to tie together, we think that more than half of the population has been killed since commercial fisheries really started sort of back in the 1980s or so. Probably a little bit less than that in the Atlantic Ocean, where there hasn't been the target fisheries, but they have been, like there's been focused whale shark fisheries in several countries in the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific, and that's massively depleted the numbers.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Is it the usual suspects, the usual countries that are doing this?
I mean, yes, ultimately. I mean, a lot of the there was demand for fins and meat and things from China. And it was really interesting actually looking at some of the old historical literature. I mean, this international trade in whale shark fins has been going on since the earliest reference I found was, 1907. So this has been happening for a long time, but I mean, it just really, really accelerated during the 1980s. There was fisheries in Philippines and Taiwan and India, and a small fishery in the Maldives that was probably more local. But like they kind of just ran out of sharks, really. Like, and I mean, when you've got a shark that doesn't even become an adult till they're maybe 40 years old, I mean, that happens very quickly. Yeah. So, it wasn't some big kind of realization of how much we should sort of protect them in most countries, unfortunately. It was more that it became uneconomic. Yeah. You asked though about what we are doing about it, and thankfully there is a lot of really good stuff going on now. So one of the good things, like as depressing as that exercise was for me, of sort of trying to tie together all these like various accounts and working out that we'd lost more than half of them over the time that I'd been alive, like that really, I think, helped mobilize people to start protecting them better. So once we realized they were like a endangered species globally, based on the sort of quantitative criteria we set for that, they were listed on the United Nations Convention on Migratory Species, Appendix 1, which is kind of the closest thing we have really to international protection. Okay. Unfortunately, it's not really legal protection. It's more like a strong suggestion. So it's up to countries now that have signed off on that they actually do have to protect the sharks in their own waters. So we're sort of working with a few different countries on that now. And like it's already led to them being protected in Mozambique, which of course was a really cool thing for me because that's where I started. And hopefully soon in Madagascar, which is another whale shark hotspot we know about now. And a few other different places too. So I think the fisheries have really slowed down. There's still a lot of accidental catches of whale sharks going on. I suspect more than we've actually known about. There's some huge gillnet fisheries that I didn't know very much about in the Indian Ocean and sort of Western Pacific. And there's like hundreds, I think thousands. Oh, actually, I think it was in a couple of 100,000 boats with nets up to about 30, 35 kilometers long, going out targeting tuna and pelagics and things. And I mean, no one's taking any information about the bycatch, but there's been some really good work done by some Pakistani researchers, and they've been like either training some of the people working on the boats to collect data, or also having their research team going out on the boats. And I mean, there's certainly whale sharks being caught out there.
Yeah.
And they estimated, I think, that fishery over the last few decades has caught over 4 million whales and dolphins.
Holy shit!
As well in those areas. So I was like, I was not aware of the extent of these fisheries, and I think the issue now is also, like, even though the targeted fisheries for whale sharks might have stopped, we know they're at a very low level. So other issues like ship strikes and that, which probably is pretty significant, and even things like plastic ingestion and that, these are all kind of cumulative impacts. Like they're not working in isolation. So they're just piling on pressure on an already depleted population. So yeah, we really the protection is starting to happen, and none too soon. There is still plenty of work to be done, and it is going to take them a long time to recover, I think, as well. So we're just kind of working through like identifying the threats and working out how to like practical solutions. Really. Yeah.
So you mentioned that they get to adulthood about the age of 40. Around about my age, really, sprightly. Is that when they reach sexual maturity, or is it earlier than that?
Yeah, so we think so. We're trying to work it out. And we know, like, it's quite tricky to work out how old sharks are. So a lot of species, like the trees, obviously, you've got the rings and trees, and you can kind of count the bands, and you can work out how old they are. And that works in a similar way, actually, to a lot of sharks. But whale sharks seem like I think they're a tricky one in that, like, a tree obviously can't move, like in sort of temperate climes, they've got a summer and they've got a winter, and they're going to go faster and they're going to go slower. Whereas a whale shark that happens to like 26-degree water, if it gets cold, it can just swim over to where the water is warmer. Yeah. So we're still trying to kind of get our heads around that a bit. But yeah, best guess is that it's about sort of 30 to 40 years old and about 8 to 9 meters in males, where we can actually, they've got, like, the only difference between them is that males have got a reproductive organ called a clasper that pokes out of their pelvic fins. So we've kind of got to sort of swim underneath them and disrespect their privacy for a moment. But females, unless, like, we don't have a way to define if they are adults or not, externally, which is where the ultrasound is obviously proving pretty useful, because we can see the internal development that's going on with them. So that's kind of I think the new frontier now. But I mean, it's a cool technique, and it'll be amazing to see. Like, one of the big questions is how often they have a litter of young. But I mean, we know they are becoming adults at about 10 meters long or so, because the only pregnant female that's been examined was like 10.6 meters long. So it's somewhere in that kind of range. But yeah. So we're still trying to work out the age, though. But yeah, it's somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah. What's I've got to ask. I've not asked it for a while. Being the title of the show is, Scuba Greatest of All Time. Can you actually think of an individual dive that is your greatest of all time, or have they all kind of blended into one now?
I wouldn't go that far. There's certainly a few standouts. I've had some pretty epic dives in the Galapagos, I'd say, working on the project up there. It is, it can be a bit unfair to other dive sites, I think, when it's really on up there, just in terms of like, you've got thousands of hammerhead sharks and really gigantic whale sharks coming through, and big yellowfin tuna and silky sharks and blacktip sharks and all this turtles and that. Just it's
insane, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. So I've definitely had some sort of standout dives up there. And a couple of really good ones in Mozambique, I guess. There's, I guess one that there's a little bit of a specific one was a really interesting one for me, was my accidental first solo dive over in Mozambique, where we were working on a film crew, working with a film crew, shooting a documentary on Andrea's work on the mantas. And the safety diver had forgotten most of his gear that was supposed to be my dive buddy, and I had to install some equipment, like so they could film it. Like they wanted to film a manta swimming past it, and he was like, "Oh, it's fine. You know, I've only got one fin and 80 bar, and no mask, I think. But I'll just hold on to the back of your tank, and you can kind of kick me around." And I was like, "Well, as a safety diver, that's not very safe."
He didn't get his salary, did he? He didn't pay him for the day's work.
Yeah, I hope not. It's like, you had one job, buddy.
Yeah.
But
you should have charged him a fee as a chauffeur.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was like, well, I know this dive site well. Like, I'll just do it by myself. Like, there's no worries at all. And went down with this equipment and was installing it and put it in and looked up, and it was a bloody white shark swimming past me, coming to check me out. And that was the first white shark I'd ever seen underwater. Yeah. So I shit myself. And then and like I was pretty deep. It was very murky, and I just finished installing this equipment, so I was quite low on air. Yeah. So I was just like, oh, geez, I've got to ascend through this water column, like just rotating like a top, trying to see what was around me in just a couple of meters visibility. And got back onto the surface and like yelled at, we had 3 boats there because there were so many of the film crew and things. Yeah. And like my boat was 100 meters away, and I'd just go, get me on any boat. And just sitting in the middle of it. And I was just like, but almost the next day we went out again, and I was still kind of buzzing from this whole encounter. And I mean, it's all in your head, right? Like, I mean, it's not like the shark tried to attack me or anything like that. It was just kind of vaguely curious. But like we went the next day, and like the same thing happened again, and I had to dive by myself in the same place. And I was just like, and I was kind of thinking about, I was going, oh, like I'm shitting myself here. And then I was like, well, actually, you know what? If I hadn't looked up at that exact moment, I never would have seen the shark.
Yeah.
So it would have been a completely normal dive for me, because it's not like it did anything. It just swam past me. So if I just pretend that I never saw it, it's totally fine. And for whatever reason, that worked in my kind of easily amused brain. So yeah, I was just like, yeah, sweet as, did the dive, didn't think about it twice. So yeah, that was definitely no, probably not my best dive, but like certainly one of my most memorable.
Yeah,
I think.
I think that'll stay with you for a while. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I've yet to have the whitey moment. I'm sure it'll come.
It's very exciting.
Yeah. I've had a similar moment with a tiger shark. The first time I saw one of those, but I think with whitey has got to be the number one that gets your bum going, isn't it?
Oh, bloody Jaws. Yeah, got lots to answer for.
Well, what can people who are listening in and reading your books and following you on social media, all those kind of things, what can they do is there anything they can do to help with the research that you guys are doing?
So I mean, we've mentioned that global database.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that people can do, if you have got any whale shark photos, if you've had a chance to swim with them before, I mean, it's cool to get those submitted to the database. Some of the most, so that's at whaleshark.org, fairly easy one to remember. Some of the most interesting sightings have come in from like what we call sort of citizen scientists, like interested divers or just kind of people on the water with a camera and an interest. So we've had some whale sharks identified from New Zealand now, and the longest distance resighting from Ningaloo Reef over in Western Australia, one was picked up in Borneo by someone that just took a photo of a whale shark as it swam past his boat. It just happened to be at the right angle that we could actually identify it from that. So that's a good one. If you go to marinemegafauna.org, the Marine Megafauna Foundation's website, you can adopt a whale shark or sign up to our free magazine as well, Ocean Giants, and that's got all the stuff about what we're up to and things on it. So that's where all our kind of new research results and things like that get released. So that's a pretty good way to stay up and learn about ways you can support the work that's going on and helping whale sharks as well.
Yeah, I think there's a fair few people out there with photos of whale sharks, and they can go rummage and start flinging them into you, hopefully. Yeah,
well, the thing is, I mean, when we think about how old whale sharks might be, even really old photos are some of the most interesting. All photos are useful, but if you've got if you're an experienced diver and you've been diving for a while, or you've got like a dad or a granddad or mum or grandmother or something that's been diving for decades, then definitely sort through their collection.
Yeah, especially if they used to wear red beanies and tight Speedos.
Yeah, that's the way forward. Yep. It'll come back in fashion.
Yeah, for sure. I'll wait until you've done it first, and then I'll contemplate it.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm that much of a trendsetter. Yeah.
Happy days. Well, Simon, I think we'll wrap it up there. I think we've been going for around about an hour or so. Is there any points that you'd like to raise for anyone who's listening just before we go? How do people reach you?
I hope that image of me in Speedos really sticks with you.
Yeah. Well, you're in Australia. You've got to buy some budgie smugglers.
When in Rome. Yeah.
Happy days. Simon, it's been an absolute pleasure, dude. And I look forward to you coming back on the show at some time in the future.
Thanks very much for having me, Matt.
My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
This is Scuba Goat Under the Sea, the podcast for the inquisitive diver.